for strikeouts in a game. 20.
Swung on and driven to deep left. And it's high. Yankees win. Yankees win. Bernie Williams homers deep in the left field seat to lead off the 11th inning on a one-run finish. And the Yankees beat the Orioles 5-4 to win Game 1 of the American League Championship Series. Burn, baby, burn. He's done it again.
There it goes! Stepping into history. He's done it. He has done it. 62. Aaron Judge is the American League single-season home run leader. The AL King. Case closed.
What is going on, baseball fans? Jeremy Latacuente here, once again back at it, bringing you our state of the franchise, looking at each and every team. From championship glory to rebuilding years, every team has a story. And the story we're going to be discussing today is that of the Chicago White Sox. I am honored to bring on my guest this evening from White Sox Now and from Sox on 35th, Tom and Noah. What's going on, guys?
I'm pretty good. How are you doing?
Doing well.
Just hoping for a better season, but that jury's out on that one.
Yeah, it was a rough season for Chicago fans, for sure. Now, as we look and get into this series, I always like to look and do kind of a retrospective. So I kind of want to get gut reactions on what was the feeling for the 2024 season and, you know, kind of where you felt the team ended up.
Yeah, I mean, if rock bottom is an adjective, I don't think it could have gotten much worse. I mean, we're literally talking about the team that set the record for the most losses in MLB history. Like, it was bad. The pitching was bad. The hitting was bad. The fielding was bad. The coaching was bad. There wasn't much to really take away from the season as a positive, unless you're looking at the farm system, which I'm sure we'll get into some of that later on. But just unwatchable baseball. I mean, I'm a lifelong baseball fan. I consider baseball like my first love, my first passion, and I was uninterested by June. It was really, really bad.
No, you hit the nail on the head with that one. Rock bottom is pretty much the best way to describe it. And, you know, the only optimistic thing is you can only go anywhere but up, right? So that's the only hope that we as White Sox fans are holding on to. Again, everything about the team was bad. It's just, and when you read more into it, especially that article that was done toward the end of the year in The Athletic by Ken Rosenthal and Britt Ghiroli, they basically, from what they uncovered, painted a pretty good picture that makes what happened last year kind of understandable. Since, I would say, the last 20-ish years, since the World Series, because again, it's crazy, it's been almost 20 years, they've been not very progressive. They have just not adapted. And how the article said, after they won in 2005, which was, I'll admit it, it's a pop-up championship. Nobody expected them to win anything at all. They were, I think the Tribune had them fourth in the division that year in front of the Royals, who were awfully bad back then, if you go back and look at them. And they just felt, hey, you know, we traded away Carlos Lee and we let go of Miguel Ordonez. We did it. So I guess basically since then they felt, if we can just get back to the way, this is not the White Sox way, but, you know, I want to give Chris Getz, the only optimism is I want to give Chris Getz the benefit of the doubt that he's being progressive and hiring people from outside the organizations to get different views and different perspectives. So that's really the best thing I think right now I, as a White Sox fan, can hold on to for hope for the future, I would think. But again, this 2024, I'm trying to put it behind me, but it's always going to be there in history when I look back back on it. So unfortunately,
I think we knew, like, going into 2024, it was going to be a bad season. I mean, most White Sox fans can look at what's on the TV in front of them and they can say, like, okay, yeah, there's a lot of holes on this roster. So I think everyone kind of knew going in they're not going to be contending for the playoffs this year. I'm not sure anyone quite got to the level that they were going to be literally the worst team of all time. But I mean, this was always going to be a multi-year process when Chris Getz took over, even though, Reinsdorf stood on the stage and said, I hired Chris Getz without any other interviews because I didn't want to lose a year. I think we all are smart enough to kind of see through that. And we could see how many problems they had and that they kind of needed to rip it down to the studs and start over. And that's exactly what Chris Getz has done. So, I mean, there's reason to think things are going to get better in the future, but it's not the best feeling to have our team permanently in the record books now as, worst team of all time. So that's something that'll be there with us forever.
And the one point I'll add to that is, what was I going to say? I guess when it comes to it, everything trickles back up to the owner, which, as we found out over the past several days, could change over the next several years, but we'll probably get into that a little later. So, but yeah, last year we all knew it was going to be bad. I just didn't think it'd be that bad because, I mean, I went to a game against the Rockies. The Sox won, and it's I just reminded a little pundit. Even we managed to beat the NL Cy Young Award winner, former White Sox pitcher Chris Phalen in a game, so that was a little bit comforting. But again, we'll talk about the possible ownership change, but it's just rock bottom, and hopefully, just we can just hold on to hope that maybe things will get better. And one thing I'll add is hopefully this core of young prospects can be more productive and churn a little better results than the last one did. Because I think you and I, Noah, can agree there was maybe some visible problems early on looking at them from the outside in, but who knows really.
No, for sure. It definitely was a season of very many lows and not so many highs, but as you said, it can only go up from here. So as we kind of look into, this upcoming season, there was a lot of things done by the White Sox. Obviously the biggest thing is going to be the trade of Garrett Crochet, bringing back Kyle Teal, who's a top prospect in Boston system. You brought in a lot of guys to give opportunities to, and some guys that I think are going to be trade candidates come deadline time. Of the moves that the White Sox made this offseason, what kind of was the one that most stood out to you?
Yeah, it's kind of hard for me to say that the transactions on the player side were major. Some of the prospects that they got, like you mentioned, Kyle Teal, I like him a lot. Braden Montgomery is another one that came over in that trade. I know the White Sox really liked him in college, and he had that injury, but the kid can rake. He's got a ton of power, so I'm a fan of him. But the two acquisitions that I think are going to be the biggest impact were not on the player side. One of them was Will Venable, the manager they just brought in. I think you're looking at a guy who is not only thought of highly by the White Sox, which has been kind of their tradition in the past, hire a guy that we love that nobody else really is paying attention to. But this is a guy who had interview requests from the Mets. He had an interview from the Guardians, and he turned those down for whatever reason and chose to come to the White Sox. So this is a guy that's been on the radar of other teams. He's been with Texas. He's been part of a World Series winning team down in Texas. So he's a guy that's pretty well respected, and there have been a lot of good things that people have said about him coming in. I think that culture change is going to be really important for them. And the other one is someone you may not have heard of before. His name's Ryan Fuller. He came over from the Orioles, but the position is director of hitting for the White Sox. So this is a guy who's going to basically oversee the position player development across the entire organization. And they made a similar hire on the pitching side last year with Brian Bannister, and he's been great so far. I've loved what he has done with their young pitchers. So developing position players, I think, has been a problem for the White Sox for several years. Outside of a couple good years they got out of Tim Anderson, I don't really remember the last position player that they drafted that has come up and been a star player for them. So the hope is that you get a guy, Ryan Fuller, who comes from the Orioles, who have been pretty good at developing hitters recently, and get him in there, get him working with your young position players, and hopefully you can improve in the player development aspect of building the contending team, which I think personally is the biggest place that they went wrong with the last rebuild was not putting enough into player development and not developing this core of guys that they had. So I think Venable and I think Fuller are going to be the biggest acquisitions of the offseason, even though we may not see that right away on the major league team. I think long term, these two guys are going to make a big impact on the team.
I absolutely agree with those two acquisitions. They come not only from winning organizations, but organizations with a track record of good internal development and evaluations. So I do like that. I'll give one player. One player that I like that they signed was Mike Tauchman. Now, granted, it's not a sexy signing. It's not a big elite guy. It's not your whatever. But he brings one thing the White Sox struggled with immensely last year. They were dead last in the league in on-base percentage. I think it was 278, if I remember correctly. I think was the final number. So he has a career on-base percentage over 340. So I think... So for full prediction, I think he's going to end up leading off on opening day. So I think that's one good acquisition that can help them in terms of on-field success, kickstart the lineup, get on base, start scoring, so you get the potential to start scoring runs because, fingers crossed Luis Robert Jr. stays healthy the whole season. Or also Andrew Vaughn gets more opportunities to show that, hey, I can be part of the future or can be a trade candidate if they decide to trade him to give him RBI opportunities. Also, I do like some changes they made in the scouting. From what I understand, they made a change in terms of how their scouting department is held accountable. They added some sort of rating system or whatever on how they judge their scouts. So from my understanding, that was not extended very well, again, from what I read, to the international side of it. So that's a good thing as well. And also to the acquisition of Brian Bannister and Ryan Fuller. From my understanding, they're also helping not in terms of on-field performance or also in the minor leagues, but also how they evaluate players coming out of the draft, whether it's international signings, also amateur draftees. So I think that, again, Bannister's already shown, with what he has so far, that he has been progressive. And I think Fuller can do the same thing. So yeah, but again, there wasn't a lot of big off-season activity, but again, the Luis Robert Jr. rumors are continuing to churn and burn as the trade deadline gets closer. So we'll see how that goes. But, we'll see if this team, when is next pushed into contention, what veteran free agents or trade acquisitions they make. So it was still productive, even though it wasn't a lot of big moves that they made.
I think that the Tauchman signing, I want to go back to that a little bit. I like it, and I think that is one piece in kind of a larger trend that I think we've seen from Chris Getz over the past year and change that he's been in charge. And I think he's targeting those type of players more. And you mentioned with Tauchman, the on-base percentage, that's a big part of his game. And that is an area that the last crop of position players really lacked. I mean, you can look at Luis Robert, ton of power, great hitter, chases every slider that's in the left-handed batter's box. It's ridiculous. Eloy Jimenez was kind of the same way when he came up. He was chasing down and away sliders every single time. And so rather than bringing up these position players that have the tools and you're trying to teach them plate discipline, you've seen Chris Getz bringing in players that already have the plate discipline. They already have that ability to, recognize strikes, swing at good pitches, let bad ones go. And then you're going to work on refining the bat to ball skills and stuff like that, which I think is much easier to teach than something like, hey, lay off these sliders. But you've seen it with Tauchman. Austin Slater's another guy that kind of is the same way. He's a high on base percentage guy. Even Joey Gallo, who they brought in as a non-roster invitee, strikes out a ton, but he also walks a ton. So he'll get on base for you. Some of the prospects that they brought in, Kyle Teal, he's been a big on-base guy in the minor leagues. Some of the guys they acquired for Eric Fetty at the deadline, which we can have a conversation about that trade if we want. But those guys like Gerald Perez, Alexander Albertus, both high on-base percentage guys in the minor leagues. So I think that is the type of position player that Chris Getz has been trying to acquire, and I think it's different. And at this point, different is good. They got to try something different because what they've been doing hasn't been working.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that, as you were saying, Noah, that kind of the change in culture, moving towards having guys that are not just swinging at everything, trying to hit the ball 800 feet and trying to be able to manufacture runs is going to be something that is important for this next crop of White Sox talent.
And one thing I'll add to the also an acquisition, I do like the acquisition of Kyle Teal in the Red Sox trade for Garrett Crochet. Even though they already have Edgar Caro, who's a top-ranked catching prospect, I think having options at that position, a position that's very physically demanding, is definitely gives them some depth and also choice of option. So let's say both end up making it to the major leagues. Okay, maybe one ends up being a backup, one ends up being the everyday guy. Or if you have one that is an elite level player and you just want to sign a veteran backup to backup whoever the starter is, then the other one could be a trade candidate for whatever. So I do like that's I think, again, looking back initially, I thought they could have gotten more out of that trade, but given the fact that Crochet only has 1 year at the elite kind of level production, it makes sense. But I do like that acquisition in terms of it gives them depth at a position that, quite frankly, if we look back at previous drafts, Zach Collins, not a very good defensive catcher. Who was the other one they drafted? Oh my goodness. He's Adam Hackenberg, good defensive catcher, just not a good offensive hitter. So I like that both catchers have offensive prowess, particularly because Carroll's a switch hitter, but they also are good at receiving the pitches and also managing a pitching staff. Again, we can debate the Yannis Yasmani Grandal signing as good or bad or okay as much as we want, but at the end of the day, I like that they have 2 catchers that are well diverse in skill set.
Now, as we kind of move into the next section here and we kind of look at some impact injuries, MLB.com had Brooks Baldwin and Drew Thorpe on the injured report. As far as those 2 guys or maybe something else that's in the pipeline right now, what's kind of the biggest injury concern for the White Sox in 2025?
Yeah, Brooks Baldwin actually played today in a spring training game, so I think he's going to be good to go. They're actually mostly healthy at this point, which has been a little bit unusual for them. They've had issues with injuries a lot over the past few years. One pretty impactful thing would be Kai Busch, left-handed pitcher. Last week, he had Tommy John surgery, so he's going to be out for the entire season. He came up for a little bit last year, and he was okay in the majors, but in the minors, he had a good season. He was part of the trade when they traded Lucas Giolito to the Angels. He was part of that trade. So obviously tough for him. There was going to be an opportunity, I think, for significant big league time this year, but unfortunately, he's going to be out the whole season. The other one who is actually healthy right now, but really we need to keep an eye on is going to be Luis Robert. I know you mentioned earlier that there could be a trade market for him, and I think his value right now is not as high as it could be, and that's because he hasn't really been able to stay healthy. He missed 2 months last year, and then the injuries have kind of impacted his performance, I think, as well. He's been not playing at 100%, and it's kind of caused him to not be playing at his best. So he's healthy, he's playing. They've signed some outfield depth to hopefully, keep him off his feet a little bit, but keeping him healthy in the first half of the season, building up his value before the trade deadline, I think is going to have massive implications for them. Other than him, they got to keep these top prospects healthy. They got to get them on the field and see what they've got.
Yeah, the Drew Thorpe one, hopefully he put that burn spurt in his elbow. Excuse me. Luckily, it was not a scare. I thought when I heard it was an elbow injury, I thought it was going to be Tommy John surgery for another pitching prospect. Luckily, it wasn't. The Kai Busch is a big loss because they've gathered quite a few lefties for the 40-man roster, so they have options. I like, for example, Cam Boozer from the Red Sox. What was it? But yeah, I think the Luis Robert Jr. one is the biggest one. There was one more I was thinking of. I'm sorry, it slipped my mind. Maybe it'll come back to me in a moment. But the fact, I just double checked it as well. Luis Robert Jr. has only played over 100 games 2 times. One being last year, he played exactly 100 games. Then his All-Star campaign, he played 145 games. Am I confident he can play over 130? I have to hope so, because we all know who his agent is. That's Scott Boras. And Robert, I think, has 2 team options after this season. And I think they're both were in the neighborhood of the mid $20 million. I think one is 25. I think the other one's 24, I believe. I'll have to double check. But, his clients will test, Boris clients do test free agency. So if he does get hurt or he struggles out of the gate, they have a very difficult decision. I mean, I think I saw someone post this on X. Could they decide to decline his option to just let him walk without getting anything back? And then somebody else brought, just trade him and get something out of it. You don't want to trade, as Noah, as you said, you don't want to trade him at an extremely low value because then you're cutting yourself short. But that'd be a very difficult decision for Chris Getz to make. So yeah, it's just something really you just don't want to have to make. But that could be the most impactful injury as far as how the turnout for this season and going forward could be. But yeah, that's there was someone I'm sorry for a minute. I was trying to remember somebody struggled with a back injury last year. I can't remember who it was, but yeah, I think the Robert injury could have the biggest impact if he gets injured, knock on wood that he doesn't.
And that kind of leads me perfectly into the next segment here. And who do you believe is the X factor for the White Sox in 2025? My pick is Luis Robert. If he can stay healthy, we've seen, like you said, Noah, when he played 145 games, he was an all-star. It also would recoup some of that value and allow you to then be able to trade him and get more back into the organization. So for you guys, who do you believe is the X factor for the 2025 campaign?
Well, I personally, I don't really think there's a world where this team is contending this year. So I'm not sure there's like one specific player that it's like, okay, if he plays well, they can be in it. Robert's a good one for sure. I think some of their young starting pitchers, I really want to see them stay healthy, and I really want to see them take a step forward. I'm talking about like Jonathan Cannon, Davis Martin, Sean Burke, those kind of guys who have potential. They have the stuff, and it's a matter of putting it together and staying on the field. So I want to see what those guys can do with an extended look in the major leagues with Brian Bannister, Ethan Katz working with them. So I would say those three guys as young starting pitchers in the rotation would be my X factor.
I'll give you two. One player who's currently set to be on the roster, one who could be but is still a prospect. I think Andrew Vaughn could be an X factor as far as a lot of things. This is a guy who's drafted third overall he was the Golden Spikes Award winner. But in fairness to his development, he did skip AA and AAA, went from high A right to the majors in 2021 after the Eloy Jimenez injury. And Antonio La Russa went up to him and says, "Hey, you got an outfield glove?" "Oh, yeah, I got one from last year when I was at the Schomburg site." "Pull on, go start taking some fly balls." So that's a funny little story. But yeah, I don't know if he's struggling with injuries or something like that, or he just has not lived up to the expectations they've had for him. I understand it's tough as we've pointed out, in a very tough environment that has not won a lot of games in the last several years. But I think with 2 years left of team control, it could be now or never for the guy. Not to say they would, because they made the decision, keep him, and they non-tendered Gavin Sheets. So they basically said, okay, you're going to get the bulk of the play again at first base. So we'll see. I mean, this could be a big year for him, determining his future, both with the White Sox and maybe his major league career. So we'll have to wait and see. The prospect, because I just remember who it was who struggled with the back injury. It's Colson Montgomery. This is a guy who was the organization's number one prospect for 2 consecutive years. Now that's Noah Schultz. He was knocked back and he was struggled with last year with a back injury. A lot of scouts do have questions whether he can be a big league shortstop. People do think his future could be at third base. And if he does win the opening day shortstop job, we'll have to wait and see. And he could be an X factor moving forward for this season and after.
No, for sure. Definitely some interesting names to take a look at this season as the White Sox play out their season in 2025. And that kind of leads into the next thing, and you just mentioned him, Tom. But the top prospect for the White Sox is Noah Schultz. What can you guys tell me about him and kind of where you project his ceiling to be?
Well, people have talked about Randy Johnson when talking about Noah Schultz, and it's easy to do that because you see a 6'10" left-handed pitcher, and immediately you think of Randy Johnson. I want to caution people not to make comparisons like that before he's ever pitched in the major leagues. But I also want to say that he is much more polished at his age than Randy Johnson was at that age. So I'm not saying he's Randy Johnson, but I'm saying that he has nasty stuff, and he is a lot of times a concern with a pitcher who's that big is their ability to repeat their delivery and to consistently throw strikes. That has not been an issue for Schultz, like at any level that he's been in. And so for me, my biggest concern is just staying on the field. He got most of a season in last year. He was kind of on an innings count, but he was healthy all year. But he's the kind of guy that has not had Tommy John surgery yet. And nowadays I feel like most pitchers do have that at least once. So I'm kind of afraid that it's coming soon. But right now he's healthy. He's looked awesome at every level of the minors he's been in. He got all the way up to Double-A last year, and he was still dealing at Double-A. He'll probably start the year in Double-A again. I don't know if making it to the majors by the end of the year is realistic, but he should be at least in a spot where 2026 he's ready to go. But there's a lot to like about that guy. His stuff is nasty, and the report out of big league camp is major league hitters facing him and having a hard time hitting the ball, saying it's incredibly uncomfortable facing him. So I'm a big fan, and he's got a great name.
Not to mention also he's a Chicago guy. He's from he went to Oswego High School. I do agree with your point. Pitchers as tall as he is do have the issue with repeat delivery and do have issues with their lower extremities when it comes to staying healthy. I know Randy Johnson, we bring him up. He had a couple of leg injuries when he was in his earlier years with the Mariners, which is why they feel he couldn't reach his full potential. And then he moved on to the Arizona Diamondbacks, where, of course, he set history with 4 straight consecutive Cy Youngs. But again, I don't want to compare Noah Schultz to him. Talking about your story about watching him face hitters during camp and pitch side sessions, it was quite a cool picture to see everybody crowd around the backstop of the cage when he went a live BP against Luis Robert Jr. I didn't find anywhere who won, quote unquote, the battle. I don't know if you found it, but it'd be interesting to see how that at-bat went. But yeah, I do think looking at some of the visuals of him, he does have a smooth delivery, and yeah, he has not. I just double checked; he does not have Tommy John surgery yet, which kind of seems like it's quote unquote a prerequisite sometimes for certain major league pitchers who throw as hard as he does. So I do like him. Again, if case the White Sox do have a knack for drafting lefties who turn to elite starting pitchers like Chris Sale, now Garrett Crochet, and not to mention that a couple spots behind him is Hagen Smith, who is another big tall lefty from a premier SEC program. So again, I agree. To wrap it up, I do agree. I don't think we'll see him in the majors this year. I think 2026 would more than likely be the realistic goal to when we see him make his debut.
Sure. Okay, and I'm not saying that like he's going to have Tommy John. There have been similar big left-handed pitchers. Chris Sale is one you mentioned. He had Tommy John, but not until like a couple of years ago. Like he made it through all of the minor leagues and several years with the White Sox before that even became an issue. And him coming out of college with that funky delivery that he had, a lot of people were concerned about his arm, and they're like, oh, he's going to get hurt. But he actually made it a long time pretty healthy. So that could happen for Schultz too. I just think that is something in the back of my mind as something that I'm a little bit concerned about, because it does seem to happen to just about everybody these days. Whereas a guy like Hagen Smith, you briefly mentioned, he has had Tommy John already. So I'm less concerned about that with him. And he's another one. He's right up there in the Schultz category. I think he was, I watched one of his games at Arkansas last year, and it was like, what do you have, like 16 strikeouts or something? It was just one of the best pitching performances I've ever seen at the college level. So I'm very high on him as well. I think he's just a little bit behind Schultz in terms of development. I think he'll probably start the year in high A, but also a guy that could move up a couple levels and be on track to hit the major leagues in 2026. So definitely some exciting top of the rotation potential lefties down in the farm system that I'm excited to watch this year.
Yeah, definitely. As we spoke about earlier, last season was not great, so you have to look up and you have to look to the future. And there are some reasons to be excited if you're a fan of the White Sox. With this series, I always like to get a bold prediction. So for you guys, what is your bold prediction for the White Sox?
In terms of team or in terms of an individual accomplishment by a player?
Either.
Okay. I will say that the White Sox, in terms of overall record, they will not, I don't believe they will lose 121 games again. My guess is they will lose, oh boy. And this is because the one thing is, people are crying about they're screaming about the fact you traded your best player. How are you going to replace that WAR production and all this stuff? Well, I look at I'll bring a comparison to 2019 when 2018 they lost exactly 100 games. Then 19 you got progressive improvements from guys like Lucas Giolito. James McCann was a nice veteran addition who had a all-star season, and those are the two that come. Oh, and also Tim Anderson won the batting title. Jose Abreu won the league led the American League in RBIs. I think you should let all baseball, but Anthony Rendon stole that. But I will say I think they're gonna. My bold prediction, I think they're going to lose less than 110 games. I think, to Noah's point about healthy, it's good to see there's most people healthy. I think Prelander Baroa is the latest injury to happen earlier today. I think he had some kind of rib injury or something. I can't remember what it was, but if they stay healthy and you get steps forward from certain guys, I don't think we're going to see too many top prospect debuts, maybe Colson Montgomery, but if certain guys take that big step forward and return, maybe Luis Robert has a great first half and helps them out in the first half with the record. Andrew Vaughn takes a big step forward. I think that could lead to a much better record, but my bold prediction is they don't lose 121 again, but I think they could reach 110 or below. That's what I think they're finishing their final record. They're not going to, but unfortunately they will finish last in the division though.
So I'm going to go more on the player side for mine. I think they're going to have two starting pitchers that are getting all-star buzz. I'm not going to say both will be all-stars, but I think Davis Martin is a guy that I am very high on. He had Tommy John 2 years ago. He came back last year, made a few starts at the end of the year, but he's a guy that Brian Bannister has talked about. And the one thing that he added with Martin was the kick change, the new changeup. And it's the same kind of pitch that he worked with Logan Webb in San Francisco on, but it's a different grip for a changeup that gives it more like vertical movement. He told the story. It was really interesting. He was watching some film. He was watching him throw a bullpen, and he basically was like, hey, why don't you try holding it this way instead? Basically just showed him a whole new pitch and was like, let's just see what happens. And he said within a week, Martin was throwing it in games and getting whiffs with it in games. And he's like, he just made that tweak to his arsenal and it completely changed who he was. But I really like his stuff. I think he's got 4 pitches that can be above average. And I'm looking at him for a full healthy season. And, every team has to have an all-star representative. So it's gotta be somebody. The other guy, and this one's a little bit more bold, I think, Sean Burke. Not a lot of people know that name, but Sean Burke, he was a 3rd-round pick by the Sox a few years ago. He made it all the way up to like AAA and was the top pitching prospect in the White Sox system. And then he had a couple of seasons where he was not healthy. He completely lost his command. He was not throwing strikes. He was walking way too many guys. And last year he worked with Bannister. He worked with Ethan Katz. He kind of got back on track, and he even came up at the end of the year. I think he made like 4 major league starts in September. But he's a guy who a lot of analytics are very high on his stuff. They like the movement on his pitches. They like the stuff. So I think if he gets a crack at the White Sox rotation, which it's not a guarantee that he makes the team at this point, but if he does, I think he's going to be a guy that kind of overperforms what people are expecting. As long as he can harness that control. So maybe he doesn't make the all-star game, but I think when we're getting closer, if he's pitching well, people are going to be starting to look at him as, oh, maybe this guy does get in. So that'll be my bold prediction. 2 starting pitchers that are getting buzz for the all-star game when it comes around.
So those are some good predictions. Mine, I feel, is not as bold. I think that anybody on the White Sox with more than 5 years of service time is getting traded. I think that that's, to say all of them, I think is the bold part. I think that there's going to be quite a few guys that do get moved towards the deadline for the White Sox to try to recoup some more prospect capital. So again, I don't feel it's that bold, but saying that everybody with more than 5 years of service time gets moved is the bold aspect. Now, as we look at the team, what's kind of the biggest question mark for the White Sox in 2025?
I would say personally, I talked about this earlier. Is this, how do I say this? Because this is a whole new regime. Obviously, Rick Hahn, Kenny Williams were ahead of the organization for so long. Kenny was the GM for a long time. Rick Hahn succeeded him when he got promoted. So this is kind of unique because it's, again, same owner, but this is new executive leadership. So the biggest question facing is, can this front office be more innovative? Can they be more progressive? Because the word I would use to describe the state of the franchise is they're stuck. They were just kind of stuck. They were just middling around. Because again, from after 2005 till 2016, when they made a decision to rebuild, it's like, just keep trying to build around this core. Keep trying to build. Let's not rebuild. And then finally, Rick Hahn went to Jerry and said, listen, we can't do this. We got to start over. And now here we are only a couple years after the rebuild was completed and they're back of contention. Now they're back into another rebuild with new leadership. But again, I like what Chris Getz has done. And, it was alluded to earlier. He hired some people from outside the organization, Ryan Fuller and Brian Bannister, people from organizations who have some track records of achieving postseason success. So can this front office, and again, I like the hire of Will Venable. I do agree. He's more on the younger side. He has coached in Chicago. He was with the Cubs for 1 year. So can he, as a more younger age manager, be more, can he connect better with the players? Can he hold his players accountable a little better? Again, he was taught by one of the best, Bruce Bochy. So can the executive leadership oversee and finish the job, and then after the rebuild is over, maintain sustainable success? And then Will Venable, is he the manager that can not only oversee this rebuild, but could he just, again, not be the rebuild manager and then move on to somebody else? Can he be the manager that can lead through a rebuild and then into the contending years?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that's definitely one of the big questions coming into the year is like, why is this time going to be different? And I think that's a question that the front office has to answer, and they have to answer it through action, not through words. The one that I had in mind is, who is going to be here in 3 years? And I think there are multiple aspects to this question, but this is something that they should be keeping in mind all year. You touched on this a little bit, but if there's somebody on your team who is not going to be here in 3 years, trade them. I mean, if they're a veteran, trade them. If they're, the other way of looking at this is, you have some young talent that's going to be coming up this year that maybe has already come up to the majors or will be this year. And you need to be evaluating these guys, and you need some of these guys to take a step forward to prove like, okay, I belong in the major leagues. I'm going to be part of this team moving forward. Because I think this year and next year are really about figuring out where the holes are and addressing them either in the draft or, maybe next year you start looking at major league free agents, more than 1 year deals. But I think that's what it's got to be. What do we need? Where are all of these guys that we have going to fit? Where do we see them in 3 years? You talked about Kyle Teal, Edgar Caro, both playing catcher. So you kind of need to look at that situation and be like, okay, which one of these guys are we going to keep at catcher? And which one are we going to find another spot for? Whether that's Kyle Teal's played some outfield. He's played like left field some in the minors. So maybe you talk about moving him there. Maybe Edgar Caro moves to first base. Like, these are questions that you need to be kind of asking yourself, and you need to be investigating through your progress that the young guys make through your draft, through the trade deadline, if they move some of these guys. But they're in a position where 3 years from now is what is what you're going for. You're not trying to win in 2025. You're trying to best position yourself to win in 2027, 2028. So I think that the who's going to be here in 3 years kind of sums it up with their mentality going into this season.
No, I agree. I think that's a very apt question for the organization. Now that kind of transitions then to what is the biggest frustration. A few times we've already mentioned Jerry Reinsdorf in this. Is he the biggest frustration for White Sox fans?
I will say absolutely. For me, the biggest frustration is the owner. I mean, you know, I've said this to people before, and I'll quote it again. He would be a nobody as a sports owner without Michael Jordan. I'm just going to say that right there. If it weren't for Michael Jordan, and not to say I'm diluting the value of Scottie Pippen, Dennis Rodman, Horace Grant, etc. I'm not diluting their value. They were big parts of winning too, but just Michael Jordan was the one who willed those teams to victory. And I believe had he, you know, you can speculate the conspiracy theories all you want about his suspension to play baseball or he left or whatever. That's a whole conspiracy theory too. But I think they would have won 8 in a row. And again, I'll say it again, you know, 2005 was a pleasant surprise to what the team was. It was a great year season, but since then, you know, Jerry, he's just been stagnant, and he has again, he is from what we always hear, he's a very loyal man. He's great to work for, but at the same time, what about being loyal to us? You're paying customers. What about us? Because, you know, and again, I can't fathom the fact is, how can you be in professional sports if you're another big frustration is last season was awful, but how can you look at yourself and say, as an owner of a sports team, and say that's acceptable? And we didn't get a public apology. We didn't get a press conference saying, I'm so sorry. You just got a letter. And in that letter, was there an apology? No. Or an actual phrase of, I'm sorry, and this will never happen again? No. So that's just the biggest frustration. And again, like I said before, I'm glad Chris Getz is bringing people in from outside the organization to help change things around, integrate analytics better, have better scouting, better evaluation, better player development. So, but again, like we said, given recent news, maybe the fact that Jerry's 89 years old, ownership could change in the next several years, but we'll have to wait and see. So, but that is obviously, I would say, for me, I would think to share the sentiment of other White Sox fans, it's a big frustration.
I would agree. I think some White Sox fans would say, oh, Jerry's cheap. Jerry doesn't spend. I don't necessarily think that is the main problem. I mean, if you look at like the 2021, 2022 payrolls, they were top 5, top 10 in baseball. Like there was no problem with the spending. I think the spending was poorly allocated. And I think that goes back to a larger issue, which is just general dysfunction in the organization. I mean, you had, before Chris Getz took over, you had Rick Hahn, who it felt like wasn't really able to do his job because he had other people influencing him and strong-arming him and telling him, no, you're going to do this, you're going to do this. You had Rick Hahn, who wanted to hire A.J. Hinch and was overruled by Jerry Reinsdorf. No, you're going to hire my buddy, Tony La Russa. And you have Kenny Williams, who hasn't been the GM in 15 years, but he's still hanging around making decisions on player personnel. So it's an organization that didn't have a good system. And I'm optimistic that that's changing. With Chris Getz taking on baseball operations by himself, he's the sole decision maker on the baseball ops side of things. What it felt like to me until recently was the White Sox won the World Series in 2005, and for the last 20 years, Jerry Reinsdorf's been trying to recreate that instead of adapting to 2020, 2025. It's like they don't use analytics. They like all of their technologies are outdated. They have the smallest player development department in the league. It's like he's stuck in his ways, and I think stuck was a good word, whichever one of you said that. I don't remember, but someone said the word stuck, and I think that's what Jerry Reinsdorf was, and maybe to some extent still is. But I do think that a 41-win season might just be enough embarrassment for him to realize, like, okay, things got to change here. I know Jeff Passan had an article earlier this offseason talking about some of the changes that they've made. I guess they have a committee that they hired. Like when Chris Getz was first hired, he brought in this committee who they were in charge of basically reviewing all of the operations of the organization and recommending changes to Jerry Reinsdorf. And so they said it was going to be a multi-year process. It was going to be a slow kind of review thing, but they've started to implement some of these changes, like hiring different people to run their international scouting department, hiring different people to run the player development side of things. So I think they're getting there. But yeah, I mean, you see it with the Bulls too. If you're into basketball at all, I mean, the Bulls are just stuck. They're in the same situation. They're not bad enough to get the number 1 pick, but they're not good enough to do anything at all. And they have a front office who just refuses to pick a direction. They partially sell, and then they sign free agents in the offseason that are not that good, but they're good enough to make them not bottom feeders. So they're just kind of stuck in the middle. And it's the same thing. You know, Reinsdorf's just refusing to bite the bullet and just acknowledge, like, we need to do things differently, because he thinks he's right. He thinks, you know, I've won championships before, and so I know what I'm doing. And you did win back in the 90s and early 2000s, but you don't know how the game works now. It's 2025. So we'll see. I'm optimistic that things are changing, but yes, I think all of the mess that they're in, all of the issues that they're in, ultimately come back to the owner and to the poor processes that he has had for many years now.
So I guess that leads perfectly into the next topic here, and it was something that Tom alluded to earlier. But with all of this kind of conundrum with ownership and kind of the direction of the team, you know, what are your feelings about the potential for a new owner in Chicago?
Yeah, I think we got some very good news on Friday. And I know for if anyone's listening and they don't know what we're talking about, there was an article written from The Athletic on Friday that talked about Justin Ishbia. He's an investor in the Phoenix Suns. His brother is the principal owner of the Phoenix Suns, but he was considered a favorite to take over the Minnesota Twins ownership because they've been for sale this offseason. And on Friday, the news came out that he had actually backed out of that and was instead increasing his minority share in the White Sox. And the White Sox, of course, denied that this has anything to do with him taking control of the team eventually, but I'm not buying that at all. I don't see why a guy that's worth $5 billion would pull out of the opportunity to own a franchise just to increase minority shares if there wasn't some kind of agreement in place that he would take over eventually. But it's good for that. Obviously, him and his brother combined have about 7 times the money that Jerry has, and people that know them talk about how aggressive they are, and they love to go big and they love to invest big. So I think that would be a great person to take over the team. I think he would spend at the top of the market, and he would do anything he can to put a winning team on the field. And plus, we took away a potential aggressive, rich owner from a division rival, so that's never a bad thing.
No, it was definitely quite happy news. From what I also, to add to what he said, I read a different article that talked about in the money he invested that some of the minority shareholders, their share percentages are going to be diluted down. So he's going to have a big ownership share. I guess it won't equal more than Jerry's share. I guess Jerry has to officially sell all of his shares to make Justin the principal owner, or the majority owner, excuse me. But I know I've been hearing through the grapevine since in the last year and a half, with Matt being the principal owner of the Suns and the Phoenix Mercury, the WNBA team. There's been chatter that both brothers have wanted to get into baseball. Justin is based here in Chicago, so it is a good fit for him. He's familiar with the city. It would be a welcome surprise. And somebody I follow on X posted this, that what Steve Cohen's net worth is, and if Matt and Justin bought the White Sox, with their combined net worth, they would be the second richest owners in all Major League Baseball. And the joke I made to him is with Cohen buying the Mets, who are considered the second the younger brother to the Yankees in New York. Steve Cohen goes Hal Steinbrenner, here, hold my beer. And for if Ishbia brothers buy the White Sox, they can go to Rick and say, hey, excuse me, hold our beers, please. We're going to step aside. So it would be a sense of optimism. Because the one thing I keep saying is, again, the highest contract that we have in franchise history is Andrew Benintendi at $75 million. We are one of 2 teams who have not signed a player past that contract dollar figure. So that is a really disappointing. And I just a quick side story. I was all in on getting Bryce Harper in the offseason. I did not want Manny Machado, to be honest. I thought that was a blessing in disguise when we didn't sign him. And turns out when he opted out and the Padres had to give him even more money at his more advanced age, I think it was a blessing for us. But I think not only would he be willing to sign a star level player who we can plaster all over our media guides and all over the stadium to drive fans, both of the White Sox and away fans, to come watch that elite level players play. I think they're going to be more competitive as far as driving a more progressive modern organization and trying to build a sustained winner. And sometimes you gotta throw a little money around to do that, especially given how the spending is going up in Major League Baseball nowadays.
I think what's important, an important detail of that whole situation that I want to say it was Dan Hayes mentioned in his article. He's used to be a White Sox writer. He's actually a Twins writer now. But he mentioned that the Reinsdorfs reached out to Justin Ishbia after they found out that he was the primary, like the front runner, basically to take over the Twins. It was them that reached out to him about increasing his share in the White Sox instead. And so that's a really interesting detail for me. I don't know. It almost feels like they're looking for a successor for Reinsdorf. So I don't know if selling is imminent for him. From what I've heard, it's not. But I think they're preparing for, like you said, he's about to turn 89. He has instructed for a long time. He has said that he wants Michael, his son, to sell the team when he dies. So I wonder if they're almost setting that up. If there was some kind of agreement like, hey, when Jerry passes away, we will just sell you our shares and we can go there. Because the report had been that the Ishbias wanted to buy the White Sox before the Twins, and they were told the White Sox are not for sale. And so that is when they pivoted to the Twins. So I don't know anything. Obviously, I'm not in the room with them, but that's just kind of me reading between the lines. I'm wondering if there's some sort of agreement there that's like, hey, eventually we'll pass the team on to you. And that was enough for him to pull the plug on his Twins deal. I feel like it would have to be something like that to get him to back out of that Twins deal, because he had already been vetted by the board. He'd been vetted by Major League Baseball. Like, he was pretty far along in the process of purchasing the Twins, and it seemed like it might happen before opening day. So I feel like there was something that was agreed to behind the scenes that we're not getting right now.
No,
one last comment I'll make is I agree with you. It's better us than a division rival.
For sure. Yeah, it definitely makes for a much more interesting conversation amongst White Sox and Twins fans. Now, as we kind of pivot back towards the on-field team, kind of what would you grade out the offense for this team heading into 25?
I would go, like I said, I know I want to be optimistic, but at the same time, I want to try and be realistic here. It's tough to do. I don't want to say a complete failure. I would say a D. I'm going to give him a D+, because, like I said, I do like the Tauchman addition. He is, even though he's coming up on his mid-30s, good defender. I do think that some of the guys who could get promoted could be helpful. I think Kyle Teal's not far away. Carroll could be not far behind. Another prediction, I think, like I said, this could be a do or die year for Andrew Vaughn. I think he takes a big step forward, and I do like the additions of Austin Slater as well. And I think, I'm going to go Again, I'm not a big fan of the Omar Narvaez signing. It was I made kind of a joke to somebody. Why don't we also sign James McCann, another former White Sox catcher, and see if we can run his offensive value from 2019. But just to be simple, there's not again without Luis Robert and Andrew Vaughn pushing the lineup forward. I just got to say D plus. I'm not going to give him a fail, but I'll just give him some optimism for D plus. That's my thing.
Yeah, I was thinking that range too. I was going to go with the D as well. There's some interesting young guys I think that we could see this year. You mentioned Teal, you mentioned Caro, Colson Montgomery should be up at some point this year. I think Brian Ramos is another guy to watch. May or may not break camp with the team. We'll see. Miguel Vargas, they gave up a lot to get him, so they seem to like him. He was very, very bad last year when he came over, but he's lost 20 pounds. He claims he's in the best shape of his life, so we'll see. We'll see how that goes. I think that's the one area that I have questions about moving forward. I really like where they're at pitching wise, organizationally at least. I think they have good depth there and some good top end talent. But I do have questions about the offense. I don't know necessarily where it's going to come from this year or in the future. They kind of need some of these guys to take a step forward or some of these other guys to kind of emerge that we weren't really expecting. So we'll see. I do expect that they're going to struggle to score runs again this year. Hopefully not quite as badly as last year where they were dead last in pretty much every offensive category. Hopefully there's at least marginal improvement there. So I'm going to go with a D.
No, for sure. So now kind of pivoting to what you just alluded to, and what do you think about the pitching grade for the upcoming season?
I'm going to go slightly better. This is we're kind of leading toward here. That's if there's anything that's going to keep them in ball games, it's going to be the pitching. I can't remember. There was a series of several games they lost late because their bullpen had some issues. I do like the acquisition of Cam Boozer from the Red Sox. Excuse me. That's another good lefty who, as a 32-year-old rookie, again, some guys are late bloomers. They figure out at a late age. He seems to good, so he gets into the Ethan Katz, Brian Bannister pitching lab. We'll see how he does there. I like the Martin Perez signing. I do believe my prediction is he will start opening day, I think. I do like what we saw to Jonathan Cannon last year. It'll be interesting to see how he builds off of that last year to this year. Like I said, we're not going to see Noah Schultz or Hagen Smith this year. But I still do believe, again, I do agree with you. Sean Burke is a guy to keep an eye on. There was one page or maybe 2 pages that listed him as a breakout candidate for this year. So I do think he's going to be someone to keep an eye on. The question is, I think, is who's going to be the closer, because it could be there's nobody who they had Kopech doing it for a brief period of time last year, but nobody really sticks out as far as someone who's grabbing that role. So that's going to be interesting. Oh, another guy I'm interested to keep an eye on is Jared Schuster, who they got from the Braves in the Aaron Bummer trade. He had issues with some knick-knack injuries, but I like to see what he does going forward. So final grade for me for the pitching this year would be going the season would be a C+.
Yeah, mine's similar again. I'm going to go with probably a C- just because I need to see it first. I did mention there's a couple of young starting pitchers that I'm pretty high on. Davis Martin, Sean Burke. I think Jonathan Cannon had some good innings last year. I think if he can repeat that, he'll be kind of a mainstay in the middle of their rotation. I think there's a lot of guys that are in the mix that are interesting. You can look at a guy like Mason Adams, who kind of came out of nowhere. He was like a 10th round draft pick, but he's been good at every level of the minor leagues, and he made it all the way to AAA last year and was still pitching well. So he's a guy that could be in the mix at some point. Another guy that came over in the Dylan Cease trade, Jairo Iriarte, he has really good stuff. He put up good numbers. He struggled with the walks a little bit down in the minors, but there's been a lot of positive buzz about him coming into camp. He's competing for one of the rotation spots. And Drew Thorpe, kind of a guy that I forget about. He's injured right now, but he's throwing again, so he'll be back hopefully not too long after opening day. I'm not as high on him as I am some of the other guys, just because I'm not sure the stuff really plays. He doesn't throw. He throws 90 or like lower 90s with his fastball, and he's got a really good changeup. That's the thing that kind of guides him. If he added a couple miles an hour on his fastball, he would remind me a lot of Lucas Giolito, but he doesn't throw the fastball quite as hard as Giolito did. So I'm not sure that it makes the changeup as effective. But I think they have a lot of interesting guys on the pitching staff, and they have. I used to always say this: when you get enough talent, like not all of them are going to work out, but you're increasing your odds that enough of them are going to work out. So you get 10 guys that you're like, he could be interesting. Like the chances that 3 or 4 of them work out is much higher than if you have 5 of them and you need 3 or 4 of them to work out. So
Definitely.
I like what they're doing depth wise. They might struggle in the bullpen. They don't really have a lot of proven veteran arms in the bullpen. Most of these guys are kind of, they've got good stuff. We'll put them in there and see if they can get outs. And there might be a lot of mixing and matching in the bullpen and guys coming up and down from the minor leagues and seeing what they've got. But they're very young. They are hopefully going to take a step forward. I could end up being much higher on them at the end of the year than I am now, or I could be much lower on them at the end of the year than I am now, just kind of depending how it goes. This is going to be a big year for that, I think. So I'm kind of in the middle with my grade. I'm going with like a C minus, with the potential to grow or the potential to drop. So we'll see.
Sticking right in the middle there. Keep it safe. So now as we kind of get towards the close here, the divisional rankings obviously are not very favorable for the White Sox going into this year. Both Pacoda and Fangraphs have you finishing the division in the Central. One has you losing 100 games. The other has you losing 99. Where do you guys see that win total for the White Sox in 2025?
Well, my bold prediction was less than 110. So if you want me to put a number on it, I'm going to go. I'm going to go with 105. Again, like I said, people are probably going to call me crazy thinking from 121 to 105. It's a big step. I do think, as we talked about, several guys are going to take a step forward and lead the way. Again, if Luis Roberts stays healthy or gets hurt, somebody I think will step up and take the spot. So that's my prediction. I think it'll be 105 losses on this season for the White Sox and a 5th place finish in the division.
I don't think there's any way it can get worse, is there? I mean, I guess there's 41 times that they won last year that they could not this year, technically, but I really think that last year they were bad, but I think that was an anomaly. I mean, if you look at the projections from last year, the way that Pacoda does it is like they simulate the season, however many times, and then they find the average. And that season that they had last year was like on the very bottom of outlier seasons for what could have happened last year. And I think naturally there's going to be a little bit of regression to the mean, and they'll win a few more games just because that's how math works. And I think like I said, they've got some young guys that could take a step forward. I think an ideal situation for the White Sox this year is winning 60 games. And the reason I say that that's ideal is because you still improve by like 20 games if you win 60 games, and you're still bad enough that you're going to be right in the mix for the number 1 pick in 2026, which I still think should be where you're at. It just, the new lottery rules kind of hose them this year. They're picking 10th after a historically bad season just because they can't pick in the bottom 3 or bottom 5 2 years in a row. But in 2026, they will be eligible again. So I think being one of the bottom feeders in the league, but not being like embarrassingly bad is probably best for them. And then, Chris Getz can point to it and say, yeah, we improved. We won 20 more games than last year. And it's not quite as big of a jump to go from that to, getting close to 500 next year or the year after. So I'm going to say 60. I'm going to say like 60 and 102, I think feels right for me. They'll still be in that 100 loss range, but I don't think it'll be as historically bad as it was last year.
No, definitely. as you said, it could get worse, but very, very unlikely that it could get worse than the 2024 season. So now, as we kind of wrap up using the title of this series, and we've kind of hinted on it already, but where do you see the state of the franchise for the Chicago White Sox going into 2025?
Like I said, the word I use to describe them is stuck, and but I do see them coming unstuck, to use the phrase. I mean, as we've talked about on this show, Chris Getz clearly is trying to make changes for the better. He's trying to move this team and modernize the organization from every aspect, every department. So I think I do give him, of course, the credit for the fact that he has a lot. Again, when you hear him in interviews, he's going to give general manager speak of, I believe we can win more games. That's that's not just what you say in an interview, but you got to be optimistic, because if the players in the locker room come out and say, he has no faith in us, then that's a slap in the face basically at this point. So I do appreciate his optimism. And I just remembered a quote he gave last year. He talked about the Tigers in, what year was that? They lost 113 games, and 3 years later, 2003, they lost, I think, 110 some odd games, and 3 years later, they were in the World Series. So I'm not saying that's where they're going to be in 3 years, but yeah, like I said, they are starting to, it does seem like there's a better, clearer direction. And I do like how this young group of young prospects, it seems more diverse in terms of overall skill set in comparison to the last one, because as we've alluded to, that those are a lot of good hitters, but in terms of strikeouts, a lot of strikeouts, and not many walks. And it's why I'm glad that, like some people advocated for on social media, I'm glad we did not sign Javier Baez to play second base. I'm optimistic as a fan since I was 5 years old. I am optimistic. With the news of the possible new ownership in the next several years, you could say even more optimistic. But again, I do believe this, so things will get better. We just have to once again endure the tough years to hopefully enjoy better success the next time when the White Sox turn into a contending team once again. So just got to endure a tough season again this year.
Yeah, I would describe the White Sox as a juggernaut. Hopefully in 5 years, juggernaut. No, it's they're in a rebuild, and everyone can see that. And hopefully they're getting to the point in the rebuild where they start to trend the other direction. Because I look at a rebuild kind of as a valley. You're trading guys away, you're going down, you hit rock bottom, and then you start improving and you start coming back up. And I'm hoping that they are getting to the point where they are starting to come back up. They've added a lot to their farm system the last couple of years, to the point where, they're like, ESPN had them ranked as the number 2 farm system in baseball coming into the season. And most outlets aren't that high on them, but they're up there. They're getting to the point where they're a top 10 system for sure. There's a lot of talent down there. And so just focusing on the development of this core, and they've got virtually nothing on the payroll starting next year, especially if they're able to move like Andrew Benintendi, Luis Robert. They're going to have pretty much nothing on the payroll. Most of their players are going to be pre-arb or arbitration eligible and just not making a lot of money. So theoretically, the budget should be there to add to this team, whether that is adding star players or developing star players and adding supplemental pieces. I think both can work. And you kind of just need to see where you're at when the time comes. But yeah, for 2025, I'm going to be watching at the beginning of the year, at least, because there's guys that I care about and there's guys that I want to see. But I could see why people would not be interested yet. It's the only reason that I am interested is because of how much I love baseball and how much I love this team. And for people who are more casual watchers, maybe come back next year or come back in 2027. There might be more for you to watch, but yeah, that's kind of where I feel like we're at coming into the year.
No, definitely. I think that for Chicago, there, as you said, there is some upside in the future. As things stand right now, again, as Tom put it earlier, another tough season to probably endure in 2025. But there's reason to be optimistic. So as we kind of close out here, I want to let everybody have an opportunity to hear more from you guys. So let everybody know where they can find you, more content from you, and more on the White Sox.
Well, for me, of course, I'm available on Instagram and X at White Sox Now, or as you can see down there at the bottom, there is my official handle at Delaplane5. You can feel free to at me and everything if you want to talk. Again, baseball also, like Noah, is my favorite sport. I've loved it since I was a little kid. The White Sox are my team, and reach out to me if you want to talk, and I'd be glad to talk about baseball. And how whether you can vent to me how mad you are or how optimistic you are, it's all good anyway.
I'm on Instagram and X as well. My handle is NoahP245. You can also find my sometimes ranting, sometimes semi-analytical articles at Sox on 35th. Also Pipeline on 35th if you're more of a trust the prospects kind of person. So you can find me there. I'm happy to talk ball whenever. I'm happy to listen to rants and also rant a little bit myself about how miserable life is as a Chicago sports fan. But that's where I'm at.
No, well, I want to thank you guys for joining me. This has been a very fun conversation, even though it obviously is a bit of a tough one going into this season with kind of the outlook that the White Sox have. But again, as we alluded to on this show, there's a lot in terms of bright horizons on the future for Chicago. So definitely want to thank you guys for joining me. If you're checking us out here on the YouTube side, make sure you hit that subscribe button down below, as well as the bell for post notifications, as it does help us continue to grow this channel. Also, if you are checking us out here on our YouTube channel, make sure you check out our link tree. It is in the description below. It helps us continue to grow as we continue to try to build out this channel. We also have our audio platform, and if you're listening to us on that side, make sure you leave a 5-star rating review, as it does help us continue to grow the channel here. So once again, for myself here from the Baseball Banter Broadcast, I want to thank you, Tom and Noah, for joining me discussing the Chicago White Sox. And I will catch you guys on the next video. Peace.